a consultant clinical psychologist and author of Users and Abusers of Psychiatry, and is also has a book, The Straight Talking Guide to Psychiatric Diagnosis. She's done lots of work and has worked as a consultant on the Bristol Clinical Psychology Doctorate, so lots of work in terms of working with with individuals who are struggling with mental distress. And she's also the lead author, along with Professor Mary Boyle, on the Power and Threat Meaning Framework. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lucy. Thank you.
I'm afraid this is back to the PowerPoint after those really impactful films and personal stories and exciting glimpses into the minds of the people who put together DSM. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is it's a little bit of a follow-up from my first talk, if anyone was here for that, which was all about the limitations of diagnosis, which James has just expanded on. And this is about a very ambitious attempt to outline an alternative to psychiatric diagnosis. If we think diagnostic paradigm is a failing one, then the question arises about what can we do differently. So this project was published by the British Psychological Society, which is my professional body, in 2018. I'm going to whiz you through it. As I've said before, you don't have to read every word on the slides. You can have the slides afterwards, and there are links, and you can follow up afterwards if you're interested. So, a power threat meaning framework, as I said, is an attempt to outline an alternative to the diagnostic model, which is bigger than any single model in itself. In a way, it's a set of principles and underlying conceptual ideas and patterns. So it includes all the stuff we've heard so far, trauma-informed perspectives and so on, but it's a kind of bigger the framework than all of that, which seeks to give extra evidence and validation to those existing non-diagnostic practices, also to suggest some more. And really, I suppose the aim is for this kind of approach to be the default model, not the medical one. So you don't just have to be lucky to come across something different. It's a first stage. It is in the process of being translated into practice in all sorts of places across the UK and indeed further afield, which suggests there's a need for it. It's attracted controversy, as you will see if you waste time on Twitter like I do, and in equal measure, actually in greater measure, it's attracted support. And it's optional, unlike the diagnostic model. It's optional. Nobody has to read, like, agree or take this on in any way whatsoever. So the project members are here. We've mentioned some of these people already. In fact, Eleanor and Jackie were two survivor members of the core project team. Mary and I are the lead authors. In the end, the project team numbered about 40 people, who about a third of whom had lived experience of being in services. And here are the links, which will probably also appear in the chat room. The website is the main link. Everything is free. The idea is to disseminate it. This is free knowledge. If you like, the documents are free to download, or you can order a hard copy. There are examples of good practice going up on the website. Several translations are in process. I've been around the world talking about it, with accompanied by other of the project team members at times. So it's a shame I hate flying so much, but apart from that, it was great to be in Brazil, be in New Zealand, be in Australia, and in fact meet some of the allies like Indigo and Matt, who've already spoken today. There's going to be a more accessible version of the framework out very soon. I will be honest with you and say the original documents are quite long and dense, purposely, because we wanted to make this as solid a foundation as we could, but the more accessible version will be available soon. So in essence, what we're trying to do is to move beyond what Mary Boyle has called the DSM mindset. In other words, not just replace particular labels. We won't call it psychosis, we'll call it a trauma reaction and so on, important though that is. But the whole way of thinking that's led us to assume that the best way of understanding problems in people's lives is one that we've borrowed from medicine, where it works quite well, but that's about things that go wrong in people's bodies, which is very different. So we wanted a framework that understands people in their relational, social and political environments and sees them as acting and making meanings within their life circumstances. They are not just the victims of illnesses that have hit them out of the blue in a kind of ruby wax kind of version. You know, people are struggling and making meaning and surviving the best they can. And this framework does not recognise a distinction between people who are said to be mentally ill and the rest of us. It's about all of us. We all struggle at times. We all face difficult circumstances in our lives at times. So these are its core aims. Not only do we think it will better serve purposes like supporting the use of narratives instead of diagnosis in practice, although it's not just about practice, it's very much about supporting grassroots movements and about helping people to make sense of their stories without any recourse to professionals if necessary, because we're all meaning makers and storytellers. But the core aims are here. It's about restoring the link between distress and social injustice is a very core aim. The link between a particular distressed individual and the almost inevitably, in some respects, social injustice and inequality context within which distress arises. If we apply a diagnosis, we lose that link. The framework intends to put it back, and therefore it's looking way beyond particular forms of therapy, although those can be useful, towards the need for social action. And because it's a very long and complicated document, we've decided to hang it on 4 core questions, which I will briefly run through with you. And these are an expansion of the slogan that's already come up today. Instead of asking what's wrong with me, ask what's happened to me. So we've kind of expanded that question into these questions. What has happened to you in PTMF terms? How is power operating in your life? How did it affect you? What kind of threats does this pose? What sense did you make of it? What is the meaning of those experiences to you? What did you have to do to survive? What kind of threat response are you using? And you would probably want to add or start with, what are your strengths? And to pull it all together, what is your story? So what we're suggesting is that you don't have to use those questions in that order, in those words, in that way. This is a kind of way of thinking about important aspects of the stress we're experiencing and the context in which it arises. So we're saying these are areas we need to think about. And if we think about these, and if you go on the website, you'll see there's a thing called a guided discussion, which if you're interested, will prompt you through these particular questions in relation to your own life or someone you're working with or supporting. If we think about these areas, it will help us to kind of structure a non-diagnostic story that may help to make better sense of our lives. They're tools for constructing or constructing narratives, and not meant to be just used at an individual level. There are family stories, there are societal stories, there are cultural stories. So I'm going to whiz you through these questions rather briefly, taking each one in turn. Power. What has happened to you? In other words, how is power operating in your life? You do not need to read all that tiny writing, but in essence, what we're saying is the really, really, really big thing that diagnosis omits, I mean, actually deliberately excludes by definition, is the influence of power in our lives, because diagnosis is saying that it's an individual problem, individual, in fact, perhaps to your brain chemistry. And many forms of psychology and psychotherapy, not the wonderful stuff from Akiba and the people who are here today, but many forms of psychology and psychotherapy also exclude the influence of power, or at least give it a very marginal place. And we wanted to put power right up there in front. So these are forms of power we need to think about. So interpersonal power is the kind of area of trauma-informed practice, isn't it? The way people can variously hurt and neglect and abuse and be violent to each other and so on. But there are many other forms of power, not all of which we pay enough attention to. In particular, for example, social or cultural capital, people's kind of class backgrounds or ethnic backgrounds or educational backgrounds, which makes life very much easier for some people than for others. And of course, applying a diagnostic label is a very good way of taking away whatever social or cultural capital you may have as you take on this new identity of mental illness, which is likely to make it more difficult for you to get employment and do all sorts of other things. We particularly place emphasis on what we called ideological power, which are the kind of hidden messages that we've already seen actually underpin DSM and ICD, for example. They're about social norms and expectations, the kind of people we're expected to be, the kind of language that's used about us to persuade us of these things without us necessarily being aware of it, the way that power interests operate through the use of language, you know, language like welfare scroungers and so on, that encourages us not to question economic policies and so on. So one of the particular abuses of ideological power from our point of view is the way that people are not given the information to, if they wish to, create alternative non-diagnostic narratives and make sense of their own experiences in that way. I mean, Indigo's story was a particularly powerful example of that. She had a feeling that it was something to do with what had happened to her, and she was ruthlessly excluded really from ever considering that. We think this is a form of, in a useful phrase, epistemic injustice. Imposing a diagnosis is an act of epistemic injustice. It's not a form of injustice we're used to thinking about, but it's a very, very, very important one in our view. Other speakers later on today will be saying rather similar things about how that personally impacted on them. So that's the first question about power. The second question is about threat. These are kind of overlapping questions, so I won't go through them in detail because power almost automatically implies threat. So all the forms of power we've mentioned run the risk of creating threats to our relationships, to our ability to feel okay about our emotions, to our social community status, to our economic and material status, to the environment, something we all need to think more about, to our bodies, to our value base and our ability to make meanings about our own lives. So we're back to ideological power again. Am I allowed, am I encouraged to think about my life in a way that makes sense to me, or am I having other people's narratives, institutional narratives, social and cultural narratives imposed on me, often in quite a brutal way? What sense did you make of it? So meanings are very, very important, and thinking about meanings is at the heart of all kinds of therapies. But from a framework point of view, we too often think about those in an individualistic way. We don't look far enough around those meanings to think about where they come from. We don't, for example, trace back the personal meanings that may make us think, you know, I'm not a good enough mother, or I haven't created a happy enough family, or I'm not a hard enough achiever, or whatever. To think, where do these discourses come from? Where do these ways of thinking come from? And nearly always we'll find that these ways of thinking, filtered through language, serve certain purposes, ideological purposes. They, on the whole, tend to operate in the interests of people who already have more power and privilege, and to the disadvantage of people who already have less power and privilege. And that's probably why they end up in mental health services in the first place. Although, as I've said, this isn't just about people who end up in services, because we all share the same society. We're all subject to the impact of power. And in fact, we think the framework is quite a helpful perspective from the point of view of people who say, as some people do, and this may well be true, well, I had a loving, comfortable family, nobody hurt or abused me, and yet I still really struggle. In that case, what's very often going on is there's a real struggle to live up to completely unrealistic social expectations, like think of the distress that many, many of our young people are going through, many of whom will have comfortable, loving, secure backgrounds, good opportunities in life. The pressures they're under enormous. It's not surprising that there seems to be so much struggles with eating, with self-harm and so on. Those are about ideological meanings ultimately, which it's very hard to question, because part of the definition is that you would kind of take that on as the way the world is. What do you have to do to survive? So this roughly corresponds to psychiatric symptoms, but it's not just about psychiatric symptoms. But as with trauma-informed practice, the assumption is that what could be called symptoms are actually creative attempts to survive extremely difficult circumstances. And these may in later life become problematic, but they started off as important creative ways of helping us to get through whatever we were experiencing. And they're partly based on the bodies. This is a model that includes the body, you know, our fight, flight, freeze responses and so on are important parts of our threat responses, but that's very different from saying you are suffering from a medical illness that's caused by some imbalance in your brain transmitters. So threat responses also includes things that are socially valued, but wouldn't land you up in a psychiatric hospital. Things like working too hard, or I'm looking at you, Joe, putting on a 14-hour online festival just for fun. By some people's definition, an extraordinarily stressful thing to do, but we think it's a creative way of surviving this difficult world and the difficult, discourses that we struggle with. So a main purpose of the framework is to restore the link between threats and threat responses. Another way of putting that, as I've said, is to restore the link between personal distress, family distress, social distress, and social injustice and inequality. These are kind of things that we kind of know, and yet as soon as we use a diagnostic narrative, we kind of forget it. And we're seeing some interesting examples of this kind of bizarre way of thinking nowadays. Apparently under COVID, something like 75% of us are meeting the criteria for anxiety disorders and depression. Well, which makes me think, well, what's wrong with the people who aren't meeting those criteria? We have a hell of a lot to be anxious and distressed about. And this is not a kind of outbreak of mental illness. And as soon as we start calling these mental health problems instead of understandable responses to nationally, internationally, globally challenging circumstances, we lose the connection between the circumstances which have given rise to these situations, and we become less able to deal with distress at its roots and to take the collective action that we need to. So diagnosis, but even terms like mental health, which is something I'm trying to avoid, but it's actually quite difficult to avoid it completely. But as soon as you start talking about a mental health problem rather than an understandable response or a common human reaction or a set of feelings, you're into that kind of medicalized way of thinking. Okay, so the framework also is, there's lots more I could say about this, but this is the brief version, is concerned to go well beyond what we think of as the traditional causal factors in what we are trying not to call mental health problems. So one of the more damaging DSM projects, as we've heard, is to export psychiatric diagnoses across the globe in what has been called an act of colonialism, rightly, I think. So in two ways, at least, the framework's very different. Firstly, it's really not about exporting this model across the globe. By definition, if our narratives are based on the meanings and the discourses that are common in a given culture, there's not going to be a universal set of perspectives or narratives or responses to distress. They're going to vary across cultures and within cultures. And actually, from the framework perspective, we in more Western or Westernized societies have an infinitely more to learn from countries that have retained very different ways of thinking about things than the other way around. So when I was in Australia and New Zealand and privileged to meet some people from Indigenous communities, it really struck me how, in Westernized societies, we've lost a sense of integration of mind, body, spirit, and natural world. That's something that we need to retain. It's not about exporting our failed model elsewhere. And the other way the framework differs from a lot of non-diagnostic practice is that we've spread the lens of causal factors very wide. We do need to think about things like intergenerational trauma that can be passed down the generations, from particular family difficulties to, well, things like all sorts of things, ways in which whole societies have been impacted by warfare or slavery or colonization or whatever. We need to include those in the mix. And similarly, we need to include a whole range of ways forward which go well beyond the traditional try this drug or try this therapy. And one of the ways forward that many people have found, people like Jackie Dillon have coined the phrase survivor mission. That's true of many of the people talking today, that people are able to make meaning out of their experiences, and sometimes describe it as turning the crap into gold, by being able to use their pain to create different ways of life and thinking and acting in the world, not only for themselves, but for others. So I'm going to show you a tiny, tiny brief example of what a story through a PTMF lens might look like. And I think Amanda's watching today. So this is a story that Amanda's kindly given us permission to use. She facilitates a peer group up in the north of England. And one of the interesting things is that she and her peer group decided collectively to think about the PTMF questions without any professional input. That's the point of a peer group, and to share together their experiences of the 4 questions and to use that as an opportunity to create different narratives for themselves. So Amanda has a longer version of this in which she gives responses to each of the questions. But the final way she put it together was like this: my story, which you can read. And you can see that, like many people who end up in services, Amanda had a very, very difficult time in life and an almost equally difficult time in services. As we know, services very often not only not helpful, but actively re-traumatizing. And she was given all sorts of horrible labels, including the personality disorder one. As you can also see, this story, without in any way denying the difficulty she's been through, is also about celebrating her strengths, and it's about giving her a very different story, of which, or rather it's about her creating her own very different story, which is essentially about, I am a survivor of very difficult circumstances and I have many strengths. And in due course on the PTMF website, if you look at it, we are going to have some examples from Matt Ball, who you've heard today, and from Ruth Dixon, who you've heard today. They have generously agreed in Matt's case to share his story, and Ruth is going to be sharing her mother's story as a kind of way of thinking about the PTMF and possibly using as training exercises. What might their these two stories have looked like had people been given a chance to think in a narrative perspective, possibly through a PTMF lens at the very beginning of their psychiatric career. So many thanks to the generosity of the many people who've been willing to share their stories. Okay, so the framework is saying storytelling and meaning making are universal human skills. The framework provides evidence for the central role of narratives of all kinds as an alternative to diagnosis. All kinds, art, music, theatre, and so on. Doesn't have to be something written, could be something spoken, could be something shared. Narratives are a means of witnessing and healing both in and beyond services. Here are some favourite quotes: the restorative power of truth-telling from that very wonderful book by Judith Herman, Trauma and Recovery. Here is a quote from Jackie Dillon and Rufus May, survivors whose names have both come up today already. Recovery is a process of reclaiming our experience in order to take back authorship of our own stories. And in bold, the 2 things that are true of the framework, also of AD4E and the messages of this festival. This is about all of us, not just those of us said to be mentally ill. Narratives of all kind can replace psychiatric diagnoses. So that's the world's briefest overview of a long, complex document, which is evolving. An increasing number of people are coming on board to support us to take its messages further. Keep an eye on the website, and thank you very much for listening. Right, I have to end this now, do I?
That's it, Lucy. Yeah, just the stop share. Worked absolutely perfectly.
We've caught up time-wise.
We have, yes. Very important piece of work, yes. Sorry, Joe.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you, Lucy. Great as ever. Really, really important stuff. Lots of chat in the chat room about that. I've just managed to have a look for one of the first times.